who they are. There are silences that do not speak, but scream. The kind that sits on the edge of every breath, heavy with what hasn't been said, rotting quietly in the corners of a shared apartment, a shared bed, a shared life. That silence had a name. Elise. For anyone watching from the outside, Elise and Jonah were the sort of couple people quietly envied. They looked effortless. Together for 6 years, they had the rhythms of shared life down to a dance. Coffee poured just as the other stirred. Groceries remembered without a word. Birthdays planned months in advance. Their laughter still sounded real, but somewhere in the invisible place between their minds, something unspoken had begun to crawl. That it wasn't betrayal in the typical sense. There was no affair, no sudden rage, no bruises to count or things broken in the night. But Elise had changed, or maybe Jonah had. Or maybe they were both becoming strangers in slow motion. Jonah noticed it first in the smallest ways. How her replies to him were technically correct, but emotionally vacant. How she began sleeping with one earbud in. How her questions stopped being curious and turned polite. Elise, meanwhile, felt herself observing him rather than loving him. The feeling was like watching a movie she'd once adored, but now saw the strings, the plot holes, the fake tears. Their apartment, once a place of echoes and music and open windows, had become disturbingly quiet. Jonah started speaking to fill it. Elise started staying out longer. Neither of them fought. That was the worst part. A fight would have at least meant fire. This was more like the slow extinguishing of oxygen. But what neither of them knew, what would never be spoken aloud, was that Elise was hiding something far stranger than indifference. It wasn't another person. It wasn't even a secret in the traditional sense. It was a thought, a single, intrusive, unrelenting thought that had begun looping inside her mind. She no longer believed that she was real, not in the dramatic sense of a person who wants to disappear. It wasn't depression. It was sharper than that. She had started to feel like an actor, not just in her relationship, but in her entire life. Like she was animating a body she had no access to. Some mornings, she'd look in the mirror and feel a stranger looking back. She'd walk into the kitchen, make breakfast for Jonah, answer emails, all with mechanical perfection. But behind her eyes, there was nothing but white noise. Jonah, in turn, had begun journaling again, a habit he hadn't touched since college. But instead of insights or confessions, his journal was full of questions. What is she thinking? Is she trying to leave? Have I done something wrong? And, most dangerously, am I imagining all this? It was in that fragile fog of unreality and emotional quiet that something began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, like a hairline crack in a frozen lake, just before the ice gives way. And all it would take was one ordinary morning. One misplaced object. One mistake. Open the door and let everything come flooding out. The apartment was modest but curated, sitting 4 floors up in a quiet, tree-lined street on the edge of the city's older district. Tall windows let in sharp lines of morning sun that painted long shadows across the parquet floor. Elise had chosen every piece of furniture, every plant, every neutral-toned rug. The space felt controlled, intentional. It had no fingerprints, no clutter, no spontaneity. Jonah had once loved that about her. The way she made space feel safe, structured, as if, through aesthetic alone, she could hold the chaos of life at bay. But lately, that same structure felt less like safety and more like distance. As though the entire apartment was a stage where they performed the version of themselves they once believed in. Elise worked in interior design, freelance now, but in high demand. Clients loved her cold precision, her restraint, the effortless elegance she could pull from chaos. She never talked much about her childhood, but Jonah knew it was strict. Her mother, a clinical psychologist, raised her alone after a bitter divorce. Everything had a label, a category, a consequence. There was no room for mess. Emotions were either managed or pathologized. Elise learned early how to curate herself to be acceptable. Jonah, by contrast, came from warmth, almost suffocating. In its love, a family of oversharers and huggers, people who cried at movies and called for no reason. He had been drawn to Elise like one might be drawn to a cold lake on a humid day. Relief, clarity, silence. She had steadied him. In return, he brought the laughter, the stories, the surprises. For a time, the exchange had felt fair, but time is greedy. It doesn't care what worked once. Jonah worked in publishing, a mid-level editor for nonfiction books, mostly memoirs and lifestyle works. He was thoughtful, unambitious in the traditional sense, and unusually perceptive. He could tell what a person needed before they said it. Elise had once said that made him feel like a mind reader. But now, it only made him more confused. Because what he was reading from her, whatever it was, made no sense. The change had started subtly. A tension in her shoulders that never left. A delay between hearing his voice and responding. She still looked at him, still smiled, but the warmth behind it was missing. And yet nothing had happened. No fights. No betrayal. No tragedy. Jonah began to worry she was sick. Something neurological. He Googled symptoms he couldn't even describe. He stopped sleeping well. He became obsessed with micro-expressions. Watching her face for signs of the Elise he used to know. Elise noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But that only made her withdraw further. She couldn't explain what she was feeling, mostly because she didn't feel anything. Not really. And when she tried, the words came out wrong. Some mornings, she'd stand in the shower for 45 minutes, not because she enjoyed it, but because the sound of the water gave her something to anchor to. The stream was real. The fog on the mirror was real. But the face in the reflection, it was only vaguely familiar. She had begun keeping a private notebook. Not a journal, exactly, but a record of actions, dates, times. She wrote down what she wore, what she ate, what she said. She wasn't even sure why. Perhaps to reassure herself she existed, that this life belonged to her. But what neither of them realized was that their careful coping mechanisms, the journaling, the note-keeping, the pretending, were accelerating the distance between them. They were no longer reacting to each other. They were reacting to simulations of the people they thought they loved. And then came the object. It was small, ordinary, but out of place. A green fountain pen. Jonah's, but not one he used often. Found on the windowsill in the guest room, a room they rarely entered. Elise saw it one morning while watering the plants. She stared at it for a long time, trying to remember when she had last seen it. But the memory didn't come. And something about that missing piece, a gap in the film reel of her mind, filled her with sudden, paralyzing dread. She picked up the pen slowly, like it might burn. Down the hall, Jonah was making coffee, humming quietly to himself. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Cars passed. Leaves stirred. Children laughed somewhere far away. But inside the apartment, a fragile illusion had cracked. Something small had shifted, and it would not go unnoticed. The pen stayed on Elise's desk for 3 days. She didn't write with it. Didn't ask Jonah about it. Just stared at it between emails and invoices and client mock-ups. It felt like an object displaced from another life. Not merely forgotten, but wrong. Each morning she'd enter the room, and there it was, green and heavy and silent, as if watching her. And each night, she'd wonder if she'd imagined it entirely. Jonah noticed something had shifted. She was quieter, and not in her usual composed way. There was a stiffness to her stillness, like someone holding their breath. He debated asking her directly, but something in her eyes warned him not to. Instead, he began observing again, like a naturalist watching an animal in unfamiliar behavior. Her habits changed. She avoided the guest room entirely now. Her sleep grew lighter, her sentences shorter. She double-checked the locks every night. And the plants, her precious, meticulously cared for plants, began to yellow that he mentioned it once, gently, and she simply said she hadn't noticed. But her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she trimmed a withering leaf. Jonah returned to his journal. This time, the entries were longer, more frantic. Not just questions now, but theories. He began to write things like, "She's slipping away, something's wrong with time in this apartment. Maybe she's not Elise anymore." The idea had crept in slowly, at first like a metaphor, a poetic musing. But now, in the midnight hours while she lay still beside him, it took on shape. Maybe Elise wasn't just changing. Maybe she had been replaced, that he knew how ridiculous it sounded. Knew how movies and books had warped the line between fantasy and psychosis. But the feeling was visceral. Every time he looked at her, some part of his brain screamed, "This is not the same person." It didn't help that her answers were often vague, as if reading from a script slightly out of sync, or that she sometimes paused before answering questions, as if double-checking her own memory. One afternoon, Jonah opened her desk drawer while she was out. He told himself it was innocent, that he was just looking for scissors. But what he found was the notebook, not her usual planner, not her sketchbook. This one was different. Stark, unadorned, and filled with dates and details and obsessive logs. March 3rd, wore blue shirt. Coffee with oat milk. No emotion. March 4th, made egg toast. Jonah smiled. I tried. Still empty. March 7th, forgot the word for balcony. Googled it. Cried. Why? March 9th, felt like I wasn't real. More than usual that he flipped faster. Dozens of entries. Repetitive, clinical, and chilling. Then, near the back, a section labeled PN. March 15th, green pen on sill. I didn't place it there. Jonah? March 16th, pen moved to desk. I did not move it. March 17th, considered gaslighting? Is he testing me? March 18th, or I'm fractured. I need to record more. Jonah's blood went cold. It wasn't just her. He was part of the breakdown. Or worse, he was the cause. He returned the notebook exactly as it was. When Elise came home, he acted normal, but his hands shook as he poured her wine. That night, Elise sensed something. Jonah's eyes lingered too long. His tone was too even. She didn't know he'd read the notebook, but she felt it. The next morning, the pen was gone. Elise didn't ask about it. Jonah didn't mention it. But both noticed. The silence between them changed. No longer empty, but loaded. Watching, Jonah began questioning his own reality now. Was the pen even there to begin with? Did he move it? Was this Elise's unraveling, or his own? He started staying up late, rereading old texts between them, trying to find signs of warmth, of humor, of her. He opened her old photo folders, scanned their travels, smiles, arm touches, beach days. But even those memories felt suspect now. One night, while she was in the shower, Jonah stood outside the door, listening, not to the water, but to the silence between the droplets. It sounded too consistent, like someone performing a shower. He hated the thought. He hated himself for it. Elise, on the other side, stared at the tile wall. The steam thick around her, but not warm enough to anchor her this time. She didn't feel the water, didn't feel the floor. And then, clear as a voice in her skull, "You are not supposed to be here." She gasped, but didn't scream. She waited. The voice didn't return, but the thought stayed. The night it finally broke was quiet. No storms, no sirens, just the hum of appliances, the buzz of a neighbor's television, the distant bark of a dog. Elise had begun to forget simple things. Not in a chaotic, dramatic way, but in unnerving fragments. Words would vanish mid-thought. She'd walk into a room and not know what she was meant to do. At first, she blamed stress, then poor sleep, then nothing at all, because no explanation seemed to fit. She was losing context, losing the thread of herself, and Jonah was unraveling in parallel. He no longer trusted what he saw. Had he left the hallway light on, or had someone else Had Elise been crying in the kitchen 2 nights ago? Or had he dreamt it? Was the grocery list in his handwriting, or just made to look like it? He found himself writing strange sentences in his journal. Things like, if she isn't Elise, who is she? Is reality a two-person game? What happens if one of us lets go? They hadn't touched in 2 weeks. They moved around each other like ghosts. The air was too dense with unspoken things to allow physicality. Something had decayed in their intimacy, not from hatred, but from dissonance. Then, one morning, Jonah awoke to find Elise gone. Her phone was still on the charger. Her shoes were by the door. Her coat hung neatly in the closet. But she was gone. He called her name once, then louder, then again and again, until it echoed off the white walls like a hollow refrain. Panic rose in his throat, not like fear of harm, but fear of implication. Had he lost her completely? Had she slipped out of the world? He checked every room, even the linen closet. Then, irrationally, the rooftop. Nothing. Only when he returned to the bedroom did he notice the green pen. Sitting neatly on his pillow. He stared at it for a long time. Picked it up. It felt heavier than he remembered. Or maybe his hands had. Grown weaker, he turned it over and over in his fingers, then looked to the nightstand. There, where her notebook usually sat, was a sheet of paper, neatly folded, unlabeled. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was hers, but changed. Jagged. Tense. I don't know if I've been dreaming for 6 years, or if I've only just woken up. This place feels like memory dressed as life. You feel like something I made up to feel safe, but I can't. Be sure that if you find this, I haven't left. I've gone inward. Don't follow. Jonah felt his heart crack, not in grief, but in incomprehension. In betrayal by logic itself. He searched again, more desperately. Spoke aloud, not caring how absurd he sounded. Whispering, shouting, calling her name like it was an anchor, like he could pull her back with syllables alone. But there was only silence. And then, the guest room. He hadn't checked the guest room. He opened the door slowly. The room was dim, but not dark. Dust caught the light in lazy spirals. The curtains fluttered slightly, though the windows were closed. She was there, sitting on the floor, knees to her chest, staring at the far wall. Jonah froze. Elise, he whispered, but no reply came. Her eyes didn't move. He stepped closer, cautiously, like approaching a deer. She was breathing, blinking, but blank. A living stillness. On the floor beside her was the notebook. Open, filled edge to edge with a single repeated phrase. I am watching myself watch myself. I am watching myself watch myself. I am watching myself. Over and over, hundreds of times. The lines growing tighter, more erratic. Jonah knelt beside her, reached out, placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. Her head turned, slowly, too slowly. And then, for the first time in weeks, she looked directly at him in no fear, no warmth, just recognition, as if seeing a stranger from a dream. Her mouth moved, not a word, just one breath. A whisper so quiet, he almost missed it. You're not real. Jonah pulled his hand back as if burned. Something cracked behind his eyes then. Not understanding, not pain, something more existential. He stood slowly, backed out of the room, closed the door. Then, without knowing why, he turned on every light in the apartment. Every lamp, every switch, flooded the space with artificial certainty. And still, it felt like the dark had already won. For the next 3 days, Jonah lived like a man in a dream he couldn't wake from. Elise didn't speak again. Not once. She remained in the guest room, curled into herself like a figure drawn in soft graphite, smudged around the edges. She ate when he brought food, drank when he pressed a cup into her hands. She blinked. She breathed. But she was not there. And Jonah stopped trying to explain it. Not to himself. Not to anyone. He didn't call her mother. Didn't seek professional help. Something inside him had turned inward, the same way Elise had. The boundaries of their apartment began to blur. Daylight came and went in a slow, gray rhythm. The once organized shelves became cluttered with unopened mail, empty mugs, and neglected houseplants. The scent of lavender candles lingered beneath the stale tang of uneaten food. The green pen appeared in new places each morning, on the kitchen counter, beside the bed, once even on the shower ledge. Always alone, always silent. He stopped picking it up. He began keeping his own record now, not in his journal, but on walls. Small pencil notes scrawled near light switches, on door frames, beside mirrors. Reminders of reality. This is your hand. This is the kitchen. She was real once. He started leaving post-it notes for Elise, taped to the door of the guest room. It's me. I remember your laugh. Please come back. She never responded. But once, he found one of the notes moved, peeled off, and placed on the floor. Carefully, deliberately. That alone was enough to make him cry for the first time in weeks. Each night, Jonah sat alone at the edge of their bed, trying to recall the last time he knew what was real. Was it a moment? A week? A year ago? He searched through memories for anchor points, real ones. The sound of her humming in the kitchen, the weight of her hand on his chest, the smell of her skin beneath her collarbone. But even those began to feel suspect, like implanted dreams. Fabricated footage. Elise, meanwhile, had stopped recording anything. The notebook lay untouched, its final pages full of spirals and scrawls and bleeding ink. She no longer tried to distinguish between real and imagined. The distinction had become meaningless. Instead, she spent hours staring at her own hands, turning them, slowly, palm to sky, then back again, as if trying to find the seam where something had been sewn shut. And then, on the third night, Jonah left the apartment, not for long, just to walk, just to feel the air, to confirm the city still existed beyond their four walls. That he wandered without direction, streets empty in the late hour, shop windows glowing like memory fragments. He saw couples, dogs, a man in a red coat locking a bicycle. All of it looked too sharp, too clean, like someone else's reality. When he returned home, something had changed. The guest room door was open. Elise was gone. Again, but this time, so was the green pen. Jonah didn't panic this time, not outwardly. He walked into the guest room and stood in the center, turning slowly, scanning every detail like a detective in a crime scene he already knew was unsolvable. There was no sign of struggle, no packed bag, no trace of movement at all, except for the open window, slightly ajar, just enough to let in the cool night air. That he stepped toward it. Looked out. The street below was quiet, normal, infuriatingly so. That he waited until sunrise. Then he closed the window and sat on the bed she had haunted, folding his hands in his lap, like someone waiting for instructions that would never come. By afternoon, he began to clean, not frantically, but methodically. He removed the post-its, wiped down the counters, threw out the spoiled fruit. He repotted a plant that had long since died. It wasn't denial. It was ritual, like preparing a room for someone who might never return but still deserved a clean place to land. That evening, he sat at her desk, opened the last notebook, flipped through the spirals and repetitions and phrases written with maddening urgency. And then, at the very end, one final entry, hastily scribbled on the inside of the back cover. If you're reading this, it means I've stepped through that. I don't know where it leads, but I had to find out if I was the dreamer or the dream. That I'm sorry if you were real. Jonah closed the notebook with trembling hands. He didn't cry. Not then, not later. Instead, he began to write. Not journals, not post-its, not reminders, but memories. Reconstructed, word by word, moment by moment. Not for her, not even for himself, but for the version of them that might still exist somewhere in some other strand of perception. That he wrote about the way her brow creased when she was focused, how she cracked her knuckles when nervous, How she never finished her tea, but always made it. How she once laughed so hard she fell off the couch and cried from joy. And he wrote about the stillness, the slipping, the long, echoing silences between them, the haunting of the ordinary. Time passed. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it passed. He learned to sleep again, though the bed still felt too large. He answered emails, walked longer routes home. Sometimes he left the guest room door open. Sometimes he closed it. He never locked it. Years later, when asked by a friend or a stranger or no one at all, what happened to Elise, Jonah would simply say, "She left." And when asked why, he'd smile gently, sadly. "She didn't believe we were real." That answer always ended the conversation. But in quiet moments, he would sometimes reach for a pen, any pen, and for the briefest flicker of time, expect it to be green. To it never was. But the moment before knowing, that was enough to feel her still, not as a ghost, but as a question, and some questions are never meant to be answered. The end.